and the regular meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Councilman Campbell, motion, second by Councilmember Stipp. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. On the, we have a regular meeting which will be held immediately following this special meeting. So I guess there's no time restraints on that. The one item on the special meeting agenda, council receive information on staff's recommended changes to the infrastructure improvement plan. Finance Director Larry Lang will present. Go ahead, Larry, it's all yours.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Here we go. Do you want to drive this, or should I move it over? Thank you. What we're going to do this evening is some follow-up on the public hearing that you had a couple of weeks ago, as well as all of the input that we've received. And we're very much hoping this will be interactive with you. At the end, we will give you some specific recommendations that as a staff that we're making on this. And these would springboard forward, but we need your feedback on those recommendations. So as I'm going through, please feel free to ask questions as we're doing it. If I'm not answering questions, if we still haven't gotten to what's concerning you or what you don't understand, I really would like us to be able to try to address that today. The special meeting tonight is really intended to be a follow-up on the work session from December 16th, as well as a follow-up on the January public hearing. On February 24th, you will be asked to vote on the land use assumptions and the IIP. March 31st will be the next public hearing that we have in the process, and to meet that deadline, we actually have to send the proposed fees to the newspaper by noon on the 24th of February. So it really is going to be important that we know areas of concern that the City Council has, or areas, and that we pretty well are assured of where the votes are going to be, or what you need to do. And that's the importance of this session tonight, is to go through that. So I'm hoping that we can answer a lot of your questions as we move along. In addition to the public hearing on the 13th of January, we met with the development community in a number of different means, and we've gone over some of those comments, and I'm going to go over them a little more in depth in just a couple of minutes. But those meetings include Newland for the areas south of the river. It included Macerich, both email as well as a visit this afternoon. We had a meeting for the development community, which included people from the Home Builders Association, Multifamily Association. I think I don't recall builders themselves being there, but a couple of landowners and so forth. One of the groups that was there also was the presenter, or provided feedback to you at the public hearing 2 weeks ago, and we'll talk about that. And then we met individually with Sunbelt Commercial. So we've really tried as much as possible to meet with as many different groups as we could to get their feedback, so that you knew what feedback you were receiving as we went through the process. So if the areas of concern as we talk to the community, the first area of concern that we heard about and mentioned in here is areas not included in the study. And specifically on that subject, that was referring to areas that might be south of Pecos. There's a lot of discussion in the southern areas of our community with property owners that are ready to move forward. Those we did not include in the study, and even after we received the input, we did not include. We have no master plans. We don't have construction costs. We don't have IIP. We really have nothing to measure with. And that's one reason it's not included. And the second reason is that when you're moving forward with the IIP, you're making a commitment to move forward over the next 10 years. And so the staff recommendation is to leave those out. With that having been said, and I know I'll say it later this afternoon a couple of times, but with that having been said, we expect to be coming back. We're required to do an updated study in 5 years. The likelihood is very high that we will be doing that in 2 to 3 years. The secondary, go ahead if there's questions, I'd rather.
I think this is the time to ask this one. And you may have already answered it at some point. If we are not including an area, because for all the reasons that you just mentioned, the way I understood it is we would address the impact fee necessary at the development agreement stage. Have I twisted two facts and put them together?
I wouldn't word it that way in that we cannot add impact fees by development agreement. What I would say is that our intent would be that as they get to the point where they have their infrastructure plans, they know what the costs of the infrastructure are. At that point in time, another study could be held to calculate impact fees for an area, but you wouldn't do that for a 40-acre parcel. That would obviously be for a large area and require coordinated planning.
Okay, so we're talking about a master planned area, or an area that should be master planned, but is not yet, not included in the study. They come in tomorrow or on July 17th or whatever and say, hey, I want to develop this. We don't have anything in place. If they go through that whole process of dropping that master plan, how do we ensure that those homes are assessed for the appropriate impact that they're going to have?
Okay, first, if the infrastructure costs needed to service those homes, which would include getting infrastructure to them, were fully funded in some manner other than the impact fees, it might be possible that that area wouldn't have impact fees. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm saying that conceptually that could happen. You have to develop the plan. What is needed first? How much is it going to cost? Impact fees can be part of the means of paying for that infrastructure. If it's determined to do the impact fees, then an impact fee study would have to be done. I believe most of us are looking at, because it is a time-consuming process. First of all, putting those studies together take a long time. They don't happen overnight. That's part of why we're expecting in the next 2 to 3 years there may be indeed an update to the study. We may have more information on particular areas that today are outside of the zones. At that point, it might make sense to add them. Or if they wanted to initiate it, we did that a few years ago with the Mobile area where they did their own study, developer paid for it, and that was a zone to itself.
Okay. So there are mechanisms in place to get it, to assess the impact that.
Yes, I believe there are. It is a time-consuming process, but there are.
But there are. So we're not going to be left holding the bag for.
No, I think it would be the opposite.
Yeah,
that
that's
the developer
my impression.
or the landowner would be left holding the bag for a lot of costs that they would have to try to recover in different ways.
Got it. Okay. Just real quick, do we have any other? We have spent all these meetings talking about the IIP, and I've not heard or seen anything. I'm assuming nobody has any issues with the land use that's laid out in this plan.
Actually, that's a
that
good
coming up?
question. I was just looking through there. It did come up, and I guess we don't have it as a specific item. Interestingly, it came up from the Home Builders Association when we had the discussion with them Their concern and their conversation with us was more generic, valley-wide, was far less Goodyear specific. Their concern was that they believe that the MAG estimates are optimistic, and they cautioned us to make sure that our land use assumptions are on the conservative side also. One, so we're not planning infrastructure that we don't need, and two, because the math of it is that if we can't meet the land use assumptions, obviously that creates a burden of how do you fund the infrastructure. So it actually did come up from an area that at first I wouldn't have anticipated, but that was the nature behind their comments.
Thank you. Councilmember Campbell?
My question is partly to tag on to Councilmember Stips. Should a developer come for the Pecos area and come up with a plan, we would be able then to address it, correct?
I believe we can address the plans of financing for that infrastructure based on a large enough parcels. In other words, like I say, a 40-acre parcel, but larger parcels, we'll be able to address it. It's not ideal, I admit. It's not, but under the statutes, we'll come in either with a revised plan at that point in time.
Okay, and it could come back and we could start from there. And then if necessary, we could assess the impact fees on them at that time?
That is correct.
If that's what happens?
That process does take, just once you have the plan, it takes 200 days to get it implemented. And that's where I say it's very time consuming. But the planning process for developments like that are also very time consuming.
Okay. But
Just one other point here. You can, if a leapfrog development, and a development would come out outside of any planned area, then it could be built, but there would be no impact fees whatsoever. In other words, all the costs would be borne by the developer to fund all the infrastructure,
right.
fire stations, libraries,
Right.
whatever we would require of a typical development, and that would be the other option. It may be very unpopular, though.
And then the developer himself could see if he wanted to do a CFD to do that financing, correct?
That would be another option.
Okay. Thank you.
There's also the cost recovery. You could put a cost recovery ordinance into place for the other benefited properties to allow the developer to get some reimbursement later too. So that's also another
Just
mechanism.
like what we did for the West Citrus area.
Yeah, or the Van Buren, we did a cost recovery
Right.
when we built
Okay.
Van Buren. So that's also an alternative.
Okay. Thank you.
Just to follow up on a general comment. If we put something in a plan that we have no plan on building, then it puts us on the hook of building those. So I would tend to lean on the side of caution, and if a developer wants a leapfrog and come in and put all those improvements in, well, then hopefully he has a resource to do it.
Okay. Appreciate those questions and comments because this is the appropriate time to make sure we're getting all of that. Service areas also were an area of concern that came up, and they came up in several different contexts. One, they came up in the context of are we doing the service areas appropriately? And that was discussed at your public hearing by the consultant. City Attorney's Office has weighed in. As a result of that, in the recommendations, actually the comments that came, I believe, 2 weeks ago, the fire impact fees are being put into 2 areas, whereas they were 1 fee throughout the community. That was the proposal that came out of those comments. The library impact fee was another one that was looked at that should not be citywide, or some felt it should not be citywide. You'll see in our recommendations this evening, we're not recommending going forward with the library fee, so that isn't included in there. So that was one side of the areas, that service areas that came out of the comments that we received. The other side of that same equation came up in your public hearing a couple of weeks ago that talked about fees, and it talked about sewer lines affecting just one area but not others, and that maybe the central area should be broken into 2 or 3 planning areas. And when you get to very small planning areas, you really get into the complexity of how you're going to build that infrastructure and what happens if that's not where the permits are, and that's why we have the larger areas. Excuse me. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to the oversizing comments, but you also have the issue that these plans, where people are, we'll use a sewer line for example, they're not connecting the sewer line directly to our plant. They're connecting to other lines that exist already. And throughout the community, we have those lines that people are existing to. So I'm going to talk that a little bit more on the oversizing area, but wanted to bring that up here. The fair competition between planning areas was a comment that came that they didn't want to see fees that would, they didn't want to see the competition being the result of fees from one planned area to another. Of course, when we look at the report, the fees are considerably different between the central and south areas and the north because we provide the water and wastewater infrastructure south of I-10, whereas north generally is provided by private services. So looking at the areas that we have in the study, when we describe north, that is really the area north of I-10. And I hope you'll, please.
Make sure, I have to make sure it's on without Bill handing it to me. When the north area, and the private water companies put in those lines, and then how do they get their money back? When you're talking about,
They raise our rates.
I don't have it in the north, so that's why I'm asking, because do they just charge the consumers directly, or they don't charge the builder?
Oftentimes up there, the developer still is putting in the infrastructure for the advancement. It isn't just north. I'm going to speak generically on utility companies.
The difference.
It'd be similar to APS and other utilities that you deal with, that it's either part of the rate structure, but rarely will you find a utility that is saying, oh, you want to develop this? Okay, we'll be happy to put the infrastructure into your development. Generally, it's only major transmission lines provided by the utility, whether it be water, production lines, that type of thing, and they expect development provide the other lines to get there.
Okay.
Just a question real quick. Just for clarification, in the fire, there's one project, I guess, that's central, and then one south.
Yes.
But the one that's central was included in north of 10 as well as central, so you combine that as one fee, and then the one south.
Yes.
What's the logic of including the north of 10 in with that central pricing?
Be happy to address that. It's a good question, and we've had this conversation considerably. Our fire stations are not limited to the geographical boundaries, and the geographical boundaries of the station that'll be in the central area will also serve some of the areas in the north at the same time. Second half of that equation is while one station is out on a call, another is backfilling, and that provides some of that service. The distinction between south of the river and north of the river is that those fire stations are so far from the rest of the system that the backup and the service area, to picture the service areas overlapping between south of the river and north of the river is really kind of a stretch. They just can't get there. Whereas in between north of I-10 and the central area, there definitely are overlapping circles and service areas.
And again, I appreciate that explanation because I'm sure there were some questions dealing with that one. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Councilmember Stitt.
Larry, is this particular slide, is this indicating the new suggested?
This slide, these areas have not changed. While this slide was in there, these areas have not changed to reflect the changes. And I'm glad you brought that up. As we're going through this, a lot of this presentation is still out of the report and does not include the changes. And I'll show you where we're making changes.
Okay.
And as we're going through, but if there's a question any place, that's a great question. Let's make sure we get it answered so there's no confusion. But those boundary lines didn't change with that direction. What changed is just how we apply within particular fees. So in the case of fire, it went from 3 areas, which were, based on this, 1, 2, and 3 on this list. It went from being the same for all 3 areas to 1 and 2 being the same, and the third being different. In the case of library, it wanted to, we would have recommended changing them, but we're recommending eliminating the fee. Okay?
Any others?
Okay. Cost recovery. That comment came up about the cost recovery ordinance that the city attorney was talking about a couple of minutes. We've discussed it with the city attorney. That's more of a technical issue. Really didn't have to do with impact fees themselves. Some people that have been involved with that were wondering whether or not our cost recovery ordinance was legal, and our city attorney, I think, is fairly confident that it's appropriately structured to meet its needs at this point in time, but is always willing to receive input if there are specific changes that someone would propose. Doesn't really affect the calculations. There was no change coming out of that. How the calculations were made, that's where, I guess, the land use question that you asked earlier, that's kind of where that one came up. Then some of the other calculations, and we're going to kind of walk through that tonight. The construction sales tax, how does that come into play? How do the revenue estimates come into play? And some of those things that were required within the statutes. And I will be going over that in a few minutes, some very specific recommendations on that.
Larry,
Yes, sir.
just real quick. On the calculations on the land use, I don't want to be redundant, but does staff feel comfortable it's conservative enough that we're going to be able to collect the fees we're going to need to do these improvements as raised by, I guess, the home builders?
We built those with a consensus of staff, and I'm not going to even estimate how many man-hours of dialogue took place between various levels throughout the organization. If you would leave it to me, those numbers would be considerably lower and unrealistic. If you leave it to certain others, they would be considerably higher and equally unrealistic. As a consensus of staff, and actually this conversation came up with our utility rate consultant. They asked if we wanted to address that, and I told them in no uncertain terms that I didn't think that would be appropriate. We have a consensus, and we're all happy with it because it's a consensus that we all have bought into. That answer it?
Not totally, but I'll go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and that's a very good point, and I'm glad you gave it, because I also was concerned about the conservative aspect of it, and it certainly seemed like we were being fairly conservative. But I think the other thing, that if this was something that we said we can't look at in 2 to 3 years, that would be very frightening. To say this was done for 10. This would be a whole different conversation, I'm sure. But
Yep.
I appreciate that.
And that's a very good point, and I'm glad you brought that up, and that was discussed considerably at the staff level. I also want to point out that while I talk about my conservatism, that I'd go a lower number, you're also going to end up with less infrastructure and not dealing with your growth if you go too low. Mm-hmm. And so I really don't want to try to paint a negative picture for someone that would argue it'd be higher than I would argue. That's why you build consensus, because, one thing we all are pretty well assured on is it will be different. than what we have. It may be by one house and 1,000 square feet of commercial, but we are not accurate down to the house. I hope everyone can accept that. Oversizing, I think that's where I'm at this point. Yes. Okay. Oversizing, again, at the public hearing, the comment came up to the effect that Canyon Trails would be paying for lines in the West Goodyear area that didn't benefit them. Can fees go only towards this oversizing of lines? There's a couple of things I want to talk about that. First of all, how did we get the infrastructure in there? Let's say on the sewer lines as an example. And it's water and sewer this comes up the most on. The infrastructure got into these plans when it relates to specific developers based upon feedback from the development community that had master plans. In other words, there had to be a basis for it. What size of line are you going to put in? We can't go to an area and just say, oh, we need a sewer line here. What size do you need? What's it going to serve us? What are the land use assumptions? All of that comes into it before it gets into the plan. And really the ones in the West Goodyear area were the ones that were available at the time this was put together. Mm-hmm. We do, you know, again, I get back to, I'm not going to tell you 2 to 3 years from now there won't be other water or sewer lines that come in, but it'll have to be looked at. But at this point also, I want to point out that we're doing something a little bit different with the West Goodyear group. It's starting and hopefully will continue as a trend moving forward on all development agreements. In the past, and we're going to be talking about it later, but in the past, if you put in sewer lines, you would get credits for it, and you wouldn't pay development impact fees until you used up all of those credits. And the existing people that have those credits, those rules still apply. Well, in the case of sewer, what happens? If I've got credits that I don't pay the sewer impact fees, and we're assuming that we're going to do a plant expansion in 2016, but I built my line, we don't have enough money to build the plant. So what happened in those agreements is, and the city attorney's office was quite involved with this, but the structure is they limited the amount of credits that they get to the percentage of the impact fee that was used to calculate lines, so that the amount going towards the plant continued. That is really going to help us moving forward as these plans were, as this whole thing is implemented. I think I got everything on that, didn't I? Okay, thank you. Okay, streets. The question came up in the process. What happens if a street may be built and is not included in the IIP? That's going to be a very difficult one to add in. And the reason that's going to be difficult is because while the statutes allow replacement of infrastructure, these are my words, not the statute's words, but the concept behind it is that it has to be replacing the purpose of the infrastructure that was being put in there. And so as you're in the flat parts of the city, and I'm going to refer to north of the river when I refer to that, as you're in the flat parts of the city, we have a grid where arterials are going to be basically every square mile. So to argue that one particular road will never be built out won't make a whole lot of sense. Now, when you get south of the river in the mountains, you've got a different whole structure because you've got to build around the topography. And so you aren't going to have the square mile grids quite the same way. And so that would change it a little bit. As we went through, a lot of the discussion was all of the streets attributable to growth. And actually, as we reevaluated, we found that some of the proposed ones are really existing needs today. And so you'll see in our recommendations, we're reducing those. Traffic signals came up. We've had a number of discussions. They primarily came up with the area south of the river. North of the river, the ones that are included as traffic signals basically are two arterials together. Whereas south of the river, we may add a couple in at the request of the developer, which are collector to arterial, and that mainly is because at that point the collectors often serve the same purpose as an arterial in this area. Trails,
Quick question.
Please.
I'm sorry. I
No, that's-
might have not heard you right. You said on many of the recommendations on the streets, they're based on needs for today. So were some of those pulled out?
yes, ma'am. I apologize for lack of clarity there.
Okay, no problem.
We will show you a chart of the streets that are now in there and what got removed, and hopefully I'll clarify that.
So if those are streets that are in need of service today, are we going to have a plan on how they will be, the financing will be to?
Those will have to be part of our capital improvements planning process, and those prioritizations will have to be looked at compared with other prioritizations that we may have that do not have impact fee funding available. And they'll be competing with that.
So that will change that, because a year ago, possibly in the budget, we really were talking about a bunch of street improvements, and we had categories, I thought, of.
Yes. That capital improvement plan will change. We're working on the cash flow. There's a committee that has been established, chaired by Bob Beckley, that will be reviewing the capital improvement plan. You're going to get some feedback on it. I believe March 3rd we're going to come in and show you kind of how things ranked, and you're going to have an opportunity for input at that point in time. And then in April we'll bring back all of it to you at that point in time. But you're right about the components, the complexity of it. I do not expect the CIP to be a wholesale change from what you adopted a year ago, but we want to make sure that we are incorporating the factors that you talked to us about in November. We want to make sure that we are incorporating new information that has come up, whether it's from the impact fee statutes change or many other variables.
Thank you. We did not use projected impact fees to do our CIP, did we?
The portion of this, the IIP now in today's environment and the similar part before were rolled into the capital improvement plan. What's going to happen is after the city council adopts these impact fees, what you adopt will roll into our CIP, but its source of funding will be those specific impact fees with how much we expect to collect on them.
So consequently, there may be some projects we have to take out.
That will not cause you to have to remove projects.
Okay.
When we present the CIP to you, our interim budget managers have proposed a change in how we present it, where you're shown items and you're shown which ones you really have discretion at that point, because the ones that are already, once they get in this impact fee study, you aren't going to have discretion to change them.
No,
Okay.
right. Yeah.
So those will be shown separately from the ones that you do have discretion on,
Okay.
color-coded or something, but that way you're going to be able to have that input at that point in time.
Okay, thanks.
Larry, just to follow up on that. You're going to have CIP projects that aren't necessarily funded with impact fees.
Correct.
Correct. What's adopted here, these projects, and then we're going to see some more of them once they're taken out or what actually is left, those will be funded with strictly with these projects. Now, and I don't know if you tell me if it's going to be covered later, if I jump too far ahead, the amount of general fund money that's going to have to be pulled out, put into the impact fee fund as a result of our 3.5% sales tax versus 2.5%, and the other as a result of our past development agreements that I assume is going to get allocated proportionally across all the different impact fees. That's also going to get taken into consideration when you do your CIP, because if that's $3 million a year, that's $3 million a year that you may have had towards that. That's no longer be able to go towards that CIP. Is that an accurate statement?
That is, but if you will allow me to get to that, that is a later part of the presentation, and we're going to look at each of those elements separately first.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. On the trails, the feedback that we received, there are some that believe that the trails are not allowable within the statutes. And while we may or may not share those views, we're recommending pulling the trails out at this point. The trails that were in there, the funding was adequate only for unpaved trails. With the added maintenance and that, I think we'd rather let someone forge ahead, and in a couple, 3 years, we can always reevaluate that subject. And I think we talked about that a month ago.
Can we make sure that by that point, we have a definitive answer as if trails are allowed? Since you're saying there seems to be a, I mean, I know if the money's not there, money's not there. I respect that, but.
If I could clarify.
No, I'm not going to fight for it if it's never going to be able to be, had anyway.
No, I understand. I think I understand. I think what on the impact fee side of the equation, given the amount of the fee, the money that we would generate from it, my recommendation is that we do not include the fees. Not everyone in the city of Goodyear would give you the opinion that they are not eligible to be funded that way. That is the opinion of the Home Builders Association, but does not necessarily mean that has to be Goodyear's position. Our consultant has told us that the city of Gilbert feels strongly that they should include those fees, and my recommendation is that the city of Gilbert could be the one that paves that path, so to speak, and that we can follow up on it. Yeah, I didn't want to go there.
Yes.
I knew someone would, but yeah, guilty. But that's my recommendation. Okay.
See how that plays out. Okay.
Just a couple more points. The controversy over whether or not the trails are fundable or not through impact fees is one question. The area that we were looking at was the Bullard Wash south of the 10. There's no development out there whatsoever. A channel has to be put in there. So for many reasons, it just isn't the right time to consider that. Both the Parks Master Plan and also the Transportation Plan have that as an emphasis, and there'll be recommendations coming back on that. Along with the future development of those properties along the Bullard Wash, where we can incorporate more of a continuous plan for a trail development, it just isn't the right time to insert that into the impact fee analysis, because like you said, we're trying to be conservative, improvements that we know are going to be built, and that's just, there's too many uncertainties with the trails at this point in time.
Go ahead, Councilman.
Is there a, and I'm not sure if the design guideline revamp that we're going to go through, if that is an opportunity for us to make that part of the master planning process, or is there an option or an avenue that we can perhaps make that part of the design features as opposed to making it impact fee related? I don't know.
If I may, on the design guidelines, that'll also have a sign ordinance as part of that. We do have consultant on board that's assisting with us with that. That'll be vertical, so we're not looking at trails, those types of things specifically, but primarily vertical types of development. It is not anticipated to look at trails as part of those guidelines. That would be more like in the Parks and Trails Master Plan as they come up with some of those designs.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. I think I'd like to move forward.
What was that shopping thing?
Okay. Hey, I tried.
Nice try, but
A couple of things on the shopping came from both areas. The first area on that is on the question, because if you remember, there was a retail study that we did, and the consultant there said that stores are getting smaller. So the home builders presented an argument that said, you know, your impact fees are based on a per square foot thing. If stores are getting smaller, you should increase the amount per square foot on the stores that you're charging on impact fees so that commercial pays its proportionate share, because even though they're getting smaller, the same vehicles are traveling on the streets. The information has not provided that at this point in time, and we did not incorporate that into the study. And he admitted he was being a bit theoretical as he was espousing that argument. Then the second side, and actually this side also I think very relevant for you to consider as we go through, the impact fees as proposed would have a dramatic effect on commercial development, would increase the per 1,000 square feet or per square foot fee from $1.76 to $4.14. That's dramatic. Proportionately, that's a lot larger than the residential fee would be changing. The reason for that change, bluntly, this is a mathematical statement, not anything else. The reason for that change is certain fee categories, particularly in the streets area, traffic generation is a part of the calculation, and commercial generates traffic. Some of that traffic comes from residences, so it's a combined factor, but that fee gets higher, and our street proposed fee in the report was dramatically higher than it was in the previous impact fees. Okay, so before I get to the specific recommendations, thought I would go through kind of some underlying assumptions that we made to build these recommendations. One is, as we go through the conservative approach on the projects and the fees, we really are looked at our confidence that the infrastructure can be built within 10 years, but equally important that it can be supported with O&M costs. We don't want to build infrastructure and not be able to fund the operations of it. And then, you know, we can update it as we go along. Councilmember Osborne kind of referred to that previously. If our growth assumptions are too low, it's a lot easier to go through 2 years from now or 3 years from now and update this study to increase the land use assumptions, increase the infrastructure, and be more inclusive. It's a lot harder to modify it going downward, but I'd rather do that in 2 or 3 years if our assumptions are too high, because that can allow us to better plan for that remaining infrastructure that's been in there.
Is that something we'll be able to do in-house, or will we have to hire a consultant again for the study?
I would strongly recommend hiring a consultant for the study. The one thing I'm going to tell you is right now this process has been stretched because every city in Arizona that's doing impact fees is doing them today, same schedule. So you've got a very limited population of consultants scurrying to get all of these projects done at one point in time. And so each particular one, the ability of attention that they're able to put at each one is maybe not at the level that we would like. And I think as we move forward, we'll be able to time that so that we aren't going with every other city in the state. Okay, so what are some of these recommendations that staff is making? Police, the impact fee study for police included 91 new vehicles for police officers, which means 91 new police officers over the next 10 years. We didn't feel that that was realistic to assume as a baseline going in on the budget, and we're recommending dropping that number from 91 to 25. That's an average of 2.5 a year. That would be the equivalent of adding one shift every 2 years.
Question? You're done.
I guess my question is that looks like a really, like, if I'm the member of the public, I'm looking at that, I'm looking at a really large drop from 91 to 25, and the same thing for fire. Can you explain how, I guess, the more conservative estimates affected that? Because when you just look at those numbers, it looks a little scary. Like, are we going to have enough? If you thought we needed 91 before, now we get 25?
It's a very good question. I think my answer to this is that as we have to look forward to what our operations will be able to, with the growth coming in, what we'll be able to financially afford. And I don't want to imply to you or to the public that we didn't an intense 10-year financial forecast that went down to line items and number of positions and so forth. That's a very sophisticated model to create it. But intuitively, as you look at the revenue that will come from growth, that is just a very high level of growth to be able to fund out of your existing tax base. And so to go at that level, I think you would be setting yourself up to have future tax increases, which I would label an unintended consequence of implementing these fees.
So when it was the 91 or wherever that number came from originally, that was a really high growth model.
Right.
And when you examined it, it's like, this is a reasonable to keep up public safety, to keep up with the growth that we reasonably are expecting.
Yes, I
Okay.
couldn't have put it better myself.
It just, the numbers look a little, when you're just, if you pull up
No,
the slide
that's-
on its own, you're like, what?
Absolutely.
Well, I'm concerned with the number of 25 because right off the bat, if the mall comes in, as we anticipate, we have to have additional officers for that. And I would not want that number to be part of the 25.
You know, it's interesting on the mall. There's a lot with the mall that we're going to be exploring operationally as a staff. That I kind of look at that as a subject by itself. There are needs with the mall, without doubt. There are some commitments by the developer of the mall to fund for the first few years some police officers. I think the city manager was asked this question a couple of meetings ago and outlined it, that down the road, as we get a little closer, staff will be working on kind of operating issues relating to the mall that go beyond the police officers, but go into the full impacts to our organization and operations. And that's the appropriate time, I think, to have that analysis done. But it's a fair question, thank you.
But your 25 limit is so conservative. We need officers now.
We are not limited to the 25.
We can have more.
We can have more. All we're limiting in doing this is we're limiting the number of patrol vehicles that we can fund by impact fees based on this. We're not limited to 25 officers. That's it. Close the doors, and that's all you can hire.
Okay, well, I'm getting ahead probably, but in your presentation, you talk about impact fees no longer being paid by Pebble Creek. Am I too far ahead in this conversation
Yeah,
right
let
now?
me
let's
get
wait.
to that
And I'd
point.
like to comment on that, if I may.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Fire, the staff recommendation, as I referred to, and I think it was discussed with you 2 weeks ago, is to remove that from one service area, including south of the river, all the way up to north of I-10, and put it into two, north and south of the river, basically. And that's how those calculations are made. Library, we're recommending to eliminate the fee. The reason for that is that currently our library operation is funded by the County Library District. Within the next 5 years, that will be transitioning over to our budget. So we will be adding one budget within the next 5 years for a library, adding a second library at this time, committing to add a second library at this time. for the revenues generated, and it would only fund 59% of a 10,000 square foot library. It seems like the prudent thing for us to do is to examine that at some point in the future. The parks, the study recommended 2 parks in there. That was only based on existing level of service. We're recommending paring that down to 1 park. That would be in the central area, but would also benefit properties north of I-10 because it'd probably kind of in the northwest portion of the central area would be one of the more likely locations for that. Out of some of the feedback that we received from the development community, and in the opinion of the city attorney, and if I'm putting any words into his mouth, I will apologize and let him correct me.
I'll let you know.
That's right. We are recommending that 11% of the cost of parks that is included in the IIP be paid by non-residential development based on daytime population analysis. The statutes, as interpreted, the statutes probably require that. And that is an area that will be challenged very early on, so we're recommending to include that. I did want to pass along to you that when I met with Macerich today, his feedback to me was that, one, he didn't agree with the principle of it, and I said, well, you know, in that, we're kind of dictated by what we can do within the confines of the statutes. And the second part that they brought up is that they would, you know, they felt that they had met the requirement of parks as a commercial area by the park that they had developed within that area. I asked them to get that to me in writing, and that would be something that would require city attorney's office and others to look at to see if that would meet the terms of the statutes. So we have had that communication. I told him I would communicate to you that I did not, or, you know, that they didn't necessarily agree, but it is our position that that is the appropriate way to do these calculations.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand this. So any commercial development, new commercial centers or industrial centers, any non-residential, you're saying we'll have to pay 11%, or will not 11%, but recommended to pay 11% of something towards parks?
Yes, and that 11%, it is 11% of the total amount to be collected for the parks.
And the philosophy behind that is what?
The philosophy behind that is Senate Bill 1525 requires it.
Seriously, that's what it says in there.
Yes, that is.
So commercial development, so commercial, industrial.
Let me be fair in that, because the argument is that I might be working in the community.
And go to
I
the
live
park.
in a different community, and so I'll go have lunch at the park, or I'll go to the park during the day. And so it's not just people that live here that generate the use in the park. That is the argument, as far as why the statute and so forth. So I shouldn't be so short in my explanation, but that's the logic behind it. I do not have a calculation for that fee at this point. We're waiting on our consultant. I wanted to know the amount. We will send that to you when we have the calculation of what that does per square foot.
I mean, I understood the reasoning behind commercial paying more for the streets. You know, that makes sense, but this one did not.
The total infrastructure over the next 10 years that we are expecting from parks based on the staff recommendation would be no more than $12 million. I say no more than $12 million because I need to reconcile one thing with our consultant, but I think it's going to be closer to $9 million. So 11, what that would say, let's use 10 million because it's a nice simple number to do math with. What that would say is of the $10 million, $1.1 million would have to come from commercial, and the other 8.9 million would come from residential. So that's what's meant by the 11%, just so I'm clear on
Okay.
that. We will get you that calculation.
Thank you.
As indicated earlier, we are recommending that we keep the trails out at this point in time. The streets, and this was questions that was asked earlier a little bit. This is the recommendation for staff from staff after considerable discussion throughout the last few months of what streets should be included and what should not be included in these impact fees. The first three on that list that you see on the top were examples of streets that it was felt as staff looked at them that the demands placed on those intersections probably exist today and are not the result of future growth that will cause that change. Many of the other recommendations, particularly on the bottom half, which is the central area, were just from a standpoint of trying to moderate the amount of fee that was proposed. So it was more priority based than it was lack of growth based, if you will. In other words, the need is definitely growth generated, but the timing of that was such that you can only do so much without having fees that would be what we felt might be too high. So the staff recommendation is to lower those. There's one change that also happened from the report, and that is you see the 10 by it about halfway down in the central area for the Citrus Road, McDowell Road to Van Buren Street. In the original calculation, that was shown only in the north area. We moved it to the south area because that's where we thought the preponderance of that intersection would be used. So the total on those went from, just to give you a perspective of where we started and where we are today as a result of that, do you have the page number real handy of where that's on here?
It's on page
I see
28.
it now. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Page 28.
Yes.
This chart was based on 28. For north of I-10, the original plan showed $20,590,800, and our recommendation is approximately half that at $10,457,000. South of I-10, the original plan was $24,553,000, and our recommendation is $16,998,423. Yes.
Larry, I assume we came to these conclusions about adding, reducing, moving, et cetera, through that same consensus process you mentioned earlier?
That is correct. The people in the room included the Streets Division, the Development Services Division. I believe City Manager's Office was involved, and of course, budget staff.
Thanks.
Questions, comments on this?
I didn't, I apologize. You said south, you said north went down about half, south, I didn't hear that figure.
It was $24,553,000, so it went down about a third. Central is what I meant. I'm sorry, I said south, but I meant central. The south area.
Oh, yes.
Okay, the south area, generally that's developer driven and reimbursed to the developer out of the fees. And so we really didn't spend a lot of time worrying about that one, and it's relatively light. Thanks. So with the recommendations that we have, what are the impacts of our recommendations? The police fee, eliminating the patrol vehicles did not have obviously a very big effect on the impact fee. The reason for that, as we indicated, was committing the operating fund. So that only decreased the fee in all areas by $52. The fire fee, really that one was a result of the change that came from the comments we received from the development community. And so what happened is in the north area, that reduced the fee by north and central, reduced the fee by $162. In the south area, that actually increased the fee by $441. The library fee, and by the way, on any of these, please stop me. And if you disagree with these recommendations, tonight's really a good time to talk about that. The library fee, the recommendation is to eliminate it completely. So that's $127. Parks and Recreation, removing from 2 parks to 1, is a reduction of the fee by $1,116 and bring it down to $1,310. Parks and Recreation, eliminating trails, would be $159. Again, it's relatively small dollars coming in, relatively small dollars there, but concerned about long-term operating in that.
Hold on, Larry.
For the Parks and Rec, there isn't one for the south. Is there no fees collected for that?
The fees collected over the next 10 years south of the river, and thank you for that. That's a very good point out in the public record. The first obligation we have south of the river is to pay for the land that the existing park is on. And it will take the full 10 years to pay that obligation off. So there will be no improvements in the south area in the next 10 years. But afterwards, that's when that would kick in. Okay?
Go ahead.
The streets, the north area, you can see that just about $1,359 is the amount of the reduction. So that went down to $1,403. Central area went down by $774 to a total of $1,743.
Larry, this is just in single-family permits, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Multifamily, commercial, those are the ones.
I used the single family as proxy for this calculation. I'm going to use, because I met today with Macerich on the streets, for example, the recommendation up there, the impact of that roughly decreased at what would be $3 and I believe it was 54 cents per square foot. It virtually cut it in half to $1.75 then, just for the streets. So that was the impact on that. Proportionately, the changes are the same. I just don't have those calculated because of the complexity of the model. Our consultant is working on revising all of those, and until I didn't want to go through each calculation. And actually that brings me to what I was supposed to highlight on this at the bottom. All of these numbers are coming from me at this point in time. I won't throw any other staff on this is what I refer to as my cocktail napkin math of how I calculated these. I believe they're reasonable. The dollars will change a bit when we get it from the consultant, but we did not compute it out in every fee category. By that I mean industrial, commercial, all of that at this point. When we get that, you will be provided with that information.
But it's fair to say the allocation percentages here is probably representative, assuming these numbers on your cocktail napkin is on target.
I believe
It's
that these
relative-
percentages it is what I would look at in any fee category and what I looked at with Macerich this morning as I discussed it with them. Yes, I believe they will run very close. If not, I will explain to you why.
Okay. Councilmember Stipp.
And I think that gets to really to my question is if they're going to change, I'm imagining that it's going to be a few dollars. It's not going to be hundreds or even tens of dollars. I think it's going to be just a few. So from your initial slide, which talked about our statutory time frame that we have to work within now, we can make future judgment anyway based on these numbers. And if they
Yes.
come in a few dollars off, we're still in the same.
Yes, and that's the context that I did these calculations. So if these calculations were to differ materially, I would hope you would give me in the tens of dollars range.
For you, Larry, I can do tens.
But if these were to change materially, we would communicate with you with that and see where we'd have to go from there. But to have a frame of reference when we're asking you to give us kind of what you're thinking we're doing on these recommendations, I felt it important that you could have a frame of reference, and that's what this is for.
Go ahead.
And I know you said everyone else is like running around with the consultants trying to figure out their numbers. From what you've heard from the consultants or what you know, are we in the ballpark? Are we competitive?
I will answer that. Yep, a very good and fair question. Understanding that we're all kind of at the same point where we don't know what staff will recommend in any other community. I'm not going to put this on Elmo now, but if you ask for it, we in the December 16th presentation to you, we gave you several others. So I'm going to go through that. I'm going to use our original numbers, not the modified ones, to give you that frame of reference. There were two areas, and we just took one area out of each. We tried to take the most representative, not one that will show the highest, not one that will show the lowest, because each community is going through this. Two areas, Chandler and Gilbert, and that was the Neely area of Gilbert. Don't even know what I just said. I don't know what it means. But both of those were approximately $20,000. We were the third highest then of this group, which was about $16,667 as shown up there. And we used our central area because it included water and sewer. We didn't want to use the north area. Then as you went through some of the others, Avondale was similar in range. You go Peoria, Buckeye were in the 13s. Queen Creek was 11. Glendale was 11. Scottsdale was 6,000. They only charge it on water and sewer, by the way. Phoenix, we don't have any information on, which is, obviously a big one. So definitely I wouldn't put us in the middle. I would put us on the upper side of the middle. And, I think some of that is when you look at the numbers that drive it, our water and wastewater are really the big drivers. And where we are in our growth stages, our water and wastewater needs are quite high. But a very fair question, and it needs to be asked and out there.
That helps. And as we go on in a couple years, if we see that we are out of kilter, that's something we can take in. Like if we end up on the low end or the high end, we can look at that when we look at it a couple years too, right?
Yes. I think, and I'll use water and sewer because it is. As you can see, if you just take the difference between north and central, about $10,000 right there combined, pretty close to what the water and sewer fees would be then per house. The interesting dialogue that we'll have over time is going to be how do we fund all of that infrastructure if we choose other methods to fund it? Do we build it into the rates? Do we have a different model of how development pays for it? One of the developers, for example, on the sewer line oversizing was proposing that developers are responsible for everything except the oversizing. Approaches that we can look at, but will take some time as we're going forward, yes.
Larry, I would also think that some of these impacts are directly related to the quality of the development in our community as well.
Absolutely.
So that, we could choose to install wire hung streetlights to reduce the cost of this. I mean, so there's certain things about the city of Goodyear that we hear from our residents constantly is it's the high quality of the community, and this is a direct reflection of that. Is that
The street costs, for example, would be a clear example
Yeah.
of what you're describing.
Yeah, I realize a water line is a water line, but
Right.
but I think there's some degree of that as well. So I'm almost less interested in how everybody else lays out, because our quality and our demand is a little bit higher. And I think your point about where we are in our growth is important, an important driver of this as well. So
As we've talked, I just think I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you, but I do think counterpoint a little bit is that there will be a marketplace where these fees have to be in, or you're not going to get builders, and if you don't get the builders, you aren't going to get the commercial and
Sure.
so forth. What that level is, we all might have an opinion on, but I think we do have to be sensitive to the market to a degree.
yeah, and I'm certainly not saying we don't need to be sensitive to that, but
Right.
I tend to be a little bit more sensitive to sales tax rates and
Right.
property tax, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So, thanks.
Anything else on this before I go to the next slide? And the next slide I'm going to, you do not have. This is information I got this morning. I detest doing this, but if I don't pass it along to you, you will detest it worse, or I will hear about it worse. There have been some changes in the calculations from the water and wastewater fees from the original report. And a lot of this came from when the draft report came in, our staff reviewed the draft report, wanted to make sure it made sense and was going to work. The changes in the central planning area for the water, $600, about 10%. It came in this morning. I can't even tell you directly what that was, but it wasn't really changes in the infrastructure. It was more changes in the calculations and the gallons assumed. The best example I want to give you in this of what happened is what happened in the South. And what happened in the South is that the original report estimated that the $37 million of infrastructure that was planned in the South on water would provide 3.9 million gallons per day in added capacity. That changed in this report to about 2.6 million gallons per day. Well, if you're going to fund $37 million, the cost per gallon went up dramatically when you reduce the number of new gallons that came in there, and that caused the fee calculation to go up dramatically. I called Newland this afternoon at 5 minutes to 4 before I went to a 4 o'clock meeting and told him, I'm throwing this hand grenade at you, just want you to be aware of it. We will discuss that with them, with our production staff, our engineering staff, and with them. And make sure that everyone agrees with the math on this, because that's what we're talking about, is that calculation. Do we agree with how much water we're providing in this calculation? Had a very significant change. We will let you know how that comes out, but it's not, from my perspective, this type of thing is you've got to have the water in there. What is it going to cost to get you that water? You've got to have the wastewater. What is it going to cost, and how much does it produce? And that becomes a mathematical equation. So what we'll do is we will work these numbers to refine them and to see if that's it or not. We will provide you with the final numbers, but I wanted to explain it in the manner that it is more of how it was calculated than it is a change in the actual infrastructure.
Go ahead.
Just to clarify again, and this is per housing unit?
Yes.
Larry, I think it would be helpful when you get that detail to me, as a numbers guy like you, that's a major variance.
Yep.
So I'd like to know what the variables were initially going in that brought the one number, and what was that significant change that created this significant deviation. So, yeah, that kind of concerns me being that far off, to be honest with you.
I understand completely, and I think it was a review and communication, but we need to answer that question. I think it's fair. I can give you the math of it, but that isn't what you're asking.
No, that's not what I'm asking.
Yep.
Wait a minute, go ahead.
Okay. Is this something that, and I could be just totally off, but is this something that if Newland came back, or any developer that has a master plan community, would say, this is something I'd like to use bond money for? I'm just throwing that out there. Does that correlate at all, or no?
No, when we met with Newland, they provided us with what their needs, what they believed, and I do also want to remind you as part of this that a lot of this is based on what we refer to as the Southern Solution, because that's what's master planned at this point, and that's a higher cost than what hopefully long-term solutions will be at this point. But they came in with what the cost of the infrastructure that they realistically expect to build in the next 10 years. And we told them this has to be built 10 years from now. You know, the same criterion. I think just looking at it, and I've only had a day to look at it, and we haven't had the discussions with the people involved. I think what it was a communication issue of what that infrastructure would provide, where you might talk about, I hope you'll forgive me, but it's a simpler example. This may not be an accurate assumption, but the concept works. We need a well, and we need a line to move that well, say, to a storage tank or to a treatment facility. They might each show 1 million gallons per day. You add those 2 million gallons together, and you just got to 2 million, but it's really the same 1 million gallons that you're moving through. I think it was that type of a calculation that caused that difference. I have to be honest with you, I was always concerned on the fee. The South area's fee is about the same as ours, and it really didn't make a lot of sense to me why their water fees were that dramatically lower than in the central area. I chalked it up to that maybe they were ahead on the infrastructure, but again, that's a dialogue we will have with the people that are experts, which will include our operations staff, our engineering staff, and Newland staff.
Councilmember Campbell.
Larry, would you email that to us?
Be happy to.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bill,
I'll get you off.
Okay, Larry.
do you want to state what the original, what our current fees are in comparison with the final numbers?
Is that
This
assuming no water and
We're doing the
sewer?
construction
with
sales
sewer.
tax now.
This is
Construction
from north,
sales tax, is that
central and
next?
south.
Yeah, Bob suggested that I point out to you what the current fees are, and of course, like area, they can vary. But in the north, where you're looking at a revised estimate of $3,287, the current fee is about $3,100. So that's not a dramatic change. In the central area, good, this one agrees. The central area, the current fee is about $12,086. And the south area is $12,434. So that's a comparison to the current fees. And that was also a schedule, by the way, if any of you want to see, we did a comparison of the current fees in various communities, and that schedule was also included on the December 16th worksheet or work session presentation. We'd be more than happy to get you additional copies if you should ask for them.
Does anybody want a copy?
bet I have it. I'll go look.
Yeah, if you don't, just let us know if
Okay,
you want to see
thanks.
it. Thank you, Bob.
Go ahead, Larry.
Okay. So I'm going to move away from the specific recommendations into a couple of other areas that we have talked about. First, I'm going to talk about the construction sales tax. The Arizona statutes require that the excess portion of the construction sales tax be treated as a contribution to development fees. The city's construction sales tax rate currently is 3.5%, while the general sales tax rate is 2.5%. The differential then, the 1%, must be applied to growth. So, out of the existing construction sales tax projections, which is fiscal year 14-15, yeah, that's what we're going to use for 14-15. It's also the one that is in the 13-14 budget of $6 million. That equates to a differential of $1.7 million. So under the statutes, we are required to put that in towards the growth-related infrastructure. Okay? Questions there?
I have one. Is that a floating issue? Say, for example, if your construction sales tax turns out to be $10 million in 15-16, whatever that factor is, 1 over 3.5, I assume that's what you're using, has to be thrown into, out of the general fund, construction sales tax, has to be allocated across the different fees.
Yes. It is the actual that will prevail, but initially, as we do the study, we have to estimate it. What we will be doing and what we're leading towards is a policy that we are going to ask you to implement in this, and that policy will direct how do we deal with the sales tax, where do we put it, because I think all of us would agree we're far better to set the money aside when we collect it so that it doesn't get commingled with other funds and then later we have an obligation. So we have some recommendations on that.
So just for clarity, then the statute doesn't require you to take that 1.7 and divvy it up in all these pots of these development. Say, for example, if 10% of your development fees happen to be water, would it require 10% of that 1.7 million to put it into the water impact fee?
I do not believe it does.
Okay, so we would determine how that gets allocated, or
we're going to why don't we go a couple more?
Okay.
Let's just go a couple more and see if you still have that question.
Okay.
And if you do, city attorney may want to weigh in a bit at that point in time.
Okay. Any others?
Any other, just in the construction sales tax? Okay. I'm going to change subjects now. We'll get back to this, okay? I'm going to change subjects. So, the statutes also require the city to reimburse development fee accounts for waivers. The city of Goodyear, under the proposed impact fees, as outlined in this table, have development agreement credits that have been issued to developers for infrastructure that those developers have provided. It isn't like we were just willy-nilly granting that, but that was to pay for infrastructure. You can see this list gives you where those areas are, and this is by development agreement, and I think this is what you were referring to earlier, Councilman Campbell. By fee category, by neighborhood, where does that $30 million come from? So the sum total of it is that when you add it up, about $1.75 million per year would be for general government infrastructure, whereas about $1.27 million per year would be utility infrastructure. And again, we're reimbursing for infrastructure by these credits. So what happens is we calculate our fees. They're calculated in this study. And it says we will collect a fee, if you go on the recommendation that we gave, of $14,000 and some odd dollars per house. If someone has these credits, they will pay us less than the full fee. They might pay us zero in that category or a lesser predetermined amount. That infrastructure still has to be financed at that point in time. What I am proposing is that the City Council can make a legislative policy decision to use the construction sales tax rate differential to offset those development fee credits.
Say that again.
We can use the construction sales tax rate differential, the 1% on the construction sales tax, to offset the development fee credits.
It's not all of it, but it offsets it.
To offset it, yes. And because the general government one, if you recall from the previous slide, the general government is about 1.75 million per year. Slide before that, the construction sales tax current estimates are about 1.71 million per year. So you're right, it's not all of it, but the recommendation on this would be to apply the one towards the infrastructure costs based on the credits that are applied. Now, the flow of the cash, and this becomes very important in all of this, the flow of the cash will be that when we collect that construction sales tax, we will immediately put that money into, I'm going to call it an impact fee holding account, which will be used to be distributed based upon the collections as they're coming in. That's what we're proposing. Before we go further, questions on that, because I threw a lot at you in about 3 slides.
First of all, I think it's genius. Secondly, just to make sure that I understand it correctly, can you go back like 3 slides, I think, to that one. So if the current projection, which is we're going to use is 6 million, let's just say the actual revenue is 8.
Yes.
Now we take the 1% of the 8, and that is what that differential fills in at the bottom.
That is correct.
However, the 1.75 is a constant number.
That is correct.
So
Well,
in
it is a constant number, but it's based upon the credits as they applied. So if building comes in an area higher or lower than what we estimated that has those credits,
Yeah.
if I could go back to this, oh, excuse me, I went the wrong way. For example, if we're assuming Canyon Trails for parks, we're going to collect 100 building permits and we only collect 80 building permits, only 80 would be applied.
right.
Okay. Go ahead.
But in theory,
In
and that's
theory,
all
yes.
that this is,
Yes.
it's worse than a napkin. But in theory, if that number comes in higher, we're going to completely offset that 1.75.
Yes, that could happen, yes.
But then that could go towards the other utilities infrastructure, correct?
Yes.
Difference.
Here's where we get to the challenge. And we will be, when it goes to the utility infrastructure, and in the proposed policy, we really didn't address this, but I would recommend regardless that we would use it towards the utilities. But now you've gone against a budget policy that you have that says your utilities would be self-sufficient.
Right, right.
I think for this purpose, I would still apply it towards the utilities, but that's a choice that you could make to not do that.
And we're currently, today, if I remember this correctly, paying in the neighborhood of the $3 million credits already. This is not a
credits
brand
exist.
new expenditure for us. Let me just say it that way.
Yeah, see, this is where the statutes changed how things happened. And as a result of it, we have to change how we're doing business, and it's not necessarily changing, it's just the transition that gets difficult. What happened in the past, for example, I'll use Canyon Trails, the wastewater, as an example. Canyon Trails in the past, they put in lines. They may have contributed part of a plant. They provided infrastructure to get those credits. And as a result of that, they received all of these credits, and they're still sitting out there. And as it builds, in theory, they'll absorb all the credits. I can't tell you all of these credits will be absorbed. We don't know that. I don't know how many units they have. I don't know how many more. I can't give you the math of the 6 million. Will it be absorbed when Canyon Trails is built out, and when will that happen? But it does come first. And under all of these that are on this list, these will come 100% out of the fee. So my example on the wastewater treatment plant, on the impact fees, we're counting on building a plant in about fiscal year 16, starting it. We will not, if we get a bunch of Canyon Trails impact fees, we won't have enough to build that plant based on Canyon Trails.
Right.
This will give us that ability to do that.
Okay. No, I totally get it. This is great.
Just to make sure I understand, we've got $3 million, everything being equal on your estimates, that'll come out of the sales tax account that we collect and go into a holding account or whatever the case may be to ensure these things are whole. The only question I have when we get back to utilities are self-sufficient, and I understand this is probably the cleanest way to do it, but the problem is you got people north of 10, all right, that are on a separate utility. So if these credits that are coming into play that's going into the sales tax are south of 10 for the utilities, then you kind of, and again, that's one of the policy issues that we're going to have to discuss on whether that kind of violates our current policy or whether that policy is going to have to be modified.
That funding will have to be used, and I don't interpret, we would have no way of knowing where that construction sales tax came from. So that cannot be credited on a zone basis. Okay?
I understand that.
That's where you get into the complexity of trying to look at one fee category that one zone might benefit over another. Now, water and wastewater, obviously big numbers. I definitely understand what you're saying. I'm surely not arguing that policy is flawed. I understand and agree with you. What I will suggest to you, though, is that in the implementation of this, to set that money aside, it will still benefit all of the developers involved and all of the builders, north or south, because it will lower their fees. That cash is going to do it's either going to pay for the infrastructure directly on the infrastructure, or if there is surplus cash, it will reduce future fees as it's available. We can't use it for anything else.
No, and I understand that. I just go back to the other pieces when it's being used for utilities. North of 10 don't have city utilities,
correct,
water, sewer. So now it's probably the cleanest way to do it. I understand that, but again, just for all the council members, that's something to consider if you're going to use it for the utilities. That's all.
Okay, so question about it all makes sense for using the sales tax on the 1.75 every year. If we stuck to policy, and it's taken us a long time to get that clean with the utilities enterprises standing on their own, if we have to go back and we decide to stick with policy, this 1.27 million, where's the other option of where that money is going to be coming from?
The other option on the 1.27, if we truly didn't include that at all in the mix, and to me, I would have it at the last tier where it goes into water and wastewater, goes into the governmental first. But then it would, if you didn't use any of
where
it,
are we going to get?
Then what it would do is it would roll into the other non-utility impact fee categories.
No. I'm saying, okay,
Right.
so we come up with your proposed 1.714 million, and that covers the 1.75 million, but we still have the 1.27 million to deal with.
Okay.
Where's
Oh, I
that
understand.
money where's that revenue to pay that coming from?
That 1.27 million would have to come out of the funds that come from the rate structures. There's no other option, no other source
Do
of
we
funding.
have that kind of
We would include
contingency in there to be covering
we would
that?
include that as part of the utility rate study. That is a cost that's built in there. Good
Okay.
question.
Thank you.
That's
Okay, may I ask my question now? This
Please.
is what I was going to ask you an hour ago. Pebble Creek's and Canyon Trails residential development agreements, they're for the lifetime of the project, right?
That is
Because it's
correct.
been way over 10 years. They're not built out yet.
That is
And they
correct.
probably won't be built out until maybe another 15 or 20 years. So everything stays intact.
Yes. And I think that's a very good point in all of this. This 30 million is the outstanding credits. To assume that all 30 million of it will happen in the next 10 years is probably not realistic, as you just indicated.
Right.
Pebble Creek may be built out in 10 years. I'm thinking it might.
think
but
so.
Regardless,
Yeah.
any of these, it has a longer build-out schedule. That's why I really wanted to do each of these numbers separately so we didn't get hung up on it. The other thing I want to point out on this number is if you accept our recommendations on the lower fees, this number gets lower also.
Oh, good.
Okay?
But maybe that's a
Because
good
what
deal.
this is impact fees that are lost
Yeah.
by those credits.
Yeah.
If you charge less, there's less loss. This was based on the amount in the report. Does that make sense? I didn't confuse anyone on that?
And I have another question, if I might ask, and I may need to ask the attorney this question. For development agreements that we are doing now, are we going to take into consideration what we're dealing with today and perhaps fashion those development agreements differently? Because we did not know this was going to be coming down, and we don't know what's going to happen in 10 or 15 years with this city. And I think we need to be a little proactive if we can.
Yes, Mr. Vice Mayor, members of council. When you're looking at Pebble Creek and you're looking at Canyon Trails, you're looking at some agreements that were entered into in the 90s,
I
if not
know.
earlier.
Yeah.
And they're structured completely differently than we do development agreements today. The categories were listed in some of those agreements, and the rate that was going to be charged for each category was listed in some of those 90s, 80s development agreements. So we don't do them that way anymore.
Good.
So we've tried to build in some more protections so we don't have the issue we have with Canyon Trails and Pebble Creek.
Okay, because I really do want to protect the city and for the councils way down the road if this happens again, because we can't make up this deficit. And we never know, again, if the legislature is going to make us reinvent how we do our government, how we do provide these services to residents. And I just want us to maybe have a better handle on it. We didn't really see this coming, and then once it started coming, it was like a freight train.
Well, and I certainly recognize that. Development agreements, the legislation has changed probably 3 or 4 times.
Oh, I bet.
If not more,
Yeah.
since these agreements went into place.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Helps if I go the right direction. So we have drafted up a policy statement that would basically, if adopted by the city council, would tell us how to apply the funds and follow through the intent of the statute. And that's what this is developed to do. I'd be happy to read it for you, but you've been here long enough, and I don't want to put anyone to sleep with the wording on it. The only thing from this conversation that I would suggest, one is that, and I noticed this after we drafted it up and had, by the way, our consultant from Tischler Bice reviewed this policy and said he felt that it made sense and agreed with it. But based on this conversation and how it went, I didn't specify in there that the funds should first go into those fee categories that are general government.
Okay.
After that, my recommendation would be that then they would go into fee categories that include the water and wastewater. However, Vice Mayor Pizzillo raises the issue that instead they could be put into the funds, and the way I have it written in here is if there is a surplus in this, that it would be pro rata against those categories.
Question, Larry, that was just my thoughts. I don't know what the thoughts are of the other here on the council as far as using the construction sales tax to cover the utilities north of 10, which, you know, they're not in the city utility area. I'd like to hear the others kind of weigh in on their thoughts, because that would kind of give you, that's probably the only sticking point for direction of this whole evening. Would that be?
That's the only one I've heard so far.
Let's start over here. Go ahead.
When are you proposing to bring this policy statement to us for consideration?
We would ask you to adopt this at February 24th.
So we have some time to digest this. So I don't know that we need to worry about a rash, quote unquote, rash decision tonight. But, you know, very honestly, I'm not sure how we get around it. And I, you know, myself personally, and everybody that lives on my street is going to be affected by this decision, because we are north of I-10. But I don't know that there's a way around it. And I personally like the concept. The construction sales tax is always a moving target for us. It's not ever applied to ongoing fees or ongoing expenses, rather. So to me, it seems very logical that we simply move forward with that, barring any discussion that staff may have before the 24th that perhaps they've figured out yet another brilliant way. But I'm okay right now.
Sure.
I guess it is kind of a moving target, because although the city paid for the water of the south, that's where the growth is going to be. That's where all the construction sales tax is going to come from. And I mean, the north is almost, I don't say built out, but it's pretty much done. So everything's going to be south. So I'd like to think about it and get some more thoughts there.
You know, it took, like I said, it took us a while to get the enterprise fund to be self-sufficient. And so this feels like a backward step in doing that. I mean, it's understandable, and Sherry's point that majority of the construction sales tax will probably be coming from development south of the 10. I guess I just have to think about that, because then if we do it that way, and you do the rate study, when this fee is actually, if we didn't have this option at all, that fee may be within that. And so it's not a true picture within the rate study of saying, here's this $1.27 million that has to be paid back. And so the fees aren't reflecting that, but the money's coming from elsewhere. So I do need to kind of think about that, I believe.
Well, I'd like staff to let us know if there's an alternative if we did not elect to accept this policy. Mm-hmm. What else could we do for the north? And I say for the north. I live in the north. Mm-hmm. But because of the development agreements, we are not paying in like everyone else, but yet we're still using all of the services, and probably even more so. And we have
It's just the water and wastewater part.
Well, it is. See, we don't use the water and wastewater part for us, but what else could it use if we did it for the north? I can't think of anything. But there might be something, so if you would share that, that would be great.
Let me make sure in the conversation, these funds are not available for discretion by the city council to use for other purposes. They will have to go towards the infrastructure improvement plan. Now they can go to reduce impact fees in the non-utility area. And that's likely what the calculation would be. Just for clarification.
So that's it, just
but
the
I didn't-
wastewater
yeah,
or
I didn't want
that
an
one?
implication that that is a pot of money that you
Oh, no, I
could
knew
decide
that.
to spend to
No.
build something or
No.
do something else.
No,
I
no,
just
I knew
wanted to
that.
make sure that was clear.
I mean,
Okay.
if we don't use utilities, what else could it, and you just said it could be due to reduce the impact fees, so. Okay.
Shirley?
Well, my thoughts are that I agree with pretty much. I think we're all agreeing that we just really don't have enough information tonight, and if there's an alternative that the staff can bring forward or additional information the staff can bring forward, it would be helpful. But I think we're pretty much on the same page, but saying it differently.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember the first term, and I was proud that we actually started moving all of the money that the secondary property tax was paying to pay the debt service on the water and sewer bonds. And we finally got ourselves off in which now the utility company is self-sufficient. And it took years to get there. I would like all efforts to try to find a way to keep that policy from my perspective. You know, I don't know what the answer is, but it took years and years of trying to get that. It's a fairness issue. And not only that, it's an enterprise fund to make that enterprise fund cover its own cost. And I think that's real important that we adhere to that. Now, I know because of the statute, it's not the easiest thing in the world for you to try to come up with, Larry, but I would love to see that kind of worked out.
Okay, thank you. Moving forward then, I appreciate that input. Where are we going from here? We've talked about it. February 24th is the decision day, where we're asking for a vote. We're, and I'm going to go through after this slide. I thought what I'd do, actually, why don't I do now what I was going to do then? Let me go through what we've heard and some follow-up items there, because that may affect future discussions. What we're going to do is, first of all, I'll go back to, we talked in the water wastewater, staff is going to do analysis in the water wastewater, and we're going to confirm our concurrence with the proposed fees, that we agree with the calculation, or have them modified if we do not, because those are going to be more calculation related and far less if you will, policy questions that'll come out of that. The second item that we're going to do is we're going to run some calculations and create some options on the construction sales tax to avoid the construction sales tax being used for the utilities, and we will provide you with models or concepts of how that's going to work. Given then the time frame, February 24th is when you're voting on the IIP. But that's also the same day that we're going to be presenting or we're going to be submitting the proposed fees to the newspaper. With that, we will get those calculations out to you, and then I think maybe the city manager wants to probably follow up on this one.
Yes, what I'm going to recommend, because there are, we're trying to get the numbers finalized. We're working closely with a consultant. You're getting our best estimates on some of the fees right now, and there's enough direction that we're hearing tonight to where we need to provide additional answers to council. So I'm going to recommend that we have an additional work session between now and February 24th, to where now at that point we'll have the refined numbers, we'll have we'll have all your questions answered all in one fell swoop because otherwise on February 24th you're going to a vote, and I don't think that'd be fair to the public process.
Do we have any other questions? All right.
Just a general observation on this. You know, when we started this whole process about the IIP and whatnot, it was very important that we had these discussions that you've had with the development community. I remember we talked about this back in September, I think. So to see the list of the individual meetings that everyone has had, and to get the input for me personally, I see this as with the changes as a result of those conversations. That's what I was looking for, was to talk to the end users and really make that a dialogue, which we have always done in the past. And this new process, which forced us into a different model, has still resulted in that same thing. So for that, I'm very appreciative of staff's effort to get that done. And yeah, we're still tweaking it here as we get closer to the end. But I'm a lot more confident today, quite honestly, than I was even at the hearing that we had a couple of weeks ago, about how much whether we listened and heard and what we did as a result of those dialogues. So, I appreciate that. Thanks.
If I could, I want to thank you, but I think I'd be remiss if I did not point out that those discussions were held with the benefit of Development Services. Sherry and Joe Schmitz were both huge in that. Bob Beckley. I mean, this has been a major staff effort in a number of departments, and I really want that pointed out. I appreciate your comments on behalf of all of them.
Anything else? Well, with that, got the special meeting. We'll now convene. Next up, we have communications, but can we hold it probably to the regular meeting? Also on the agenda is information items. Can we hold that to the regular meeting?
Yes.
Also, there's a place on there for, well, first of all, do we have any comment cards for the public?
No, Vice Mayor.
Okay, thank you. There's a chance, also we have listed here for citizen comments, but we're also going to have that available at the regular meeting. Is there anybody that would want to come up now, or can they wait to the regular meeting for citizens comments? I'll get it. Comments, citizens comments. Can you wait to the regular meeting if you have any? Well, we're seeing that. Before I adjourn, if we want to take like a 10-minute to get this all set up,
Please.
do we adjourn and then
You
just?
should adjourn this meeting, and then you'll reconvene. And
Okay, all right.
Whenever you as the chair want to set it.
All right. 10 minutes, okay, everybody? Meeting's adjourned.